Let me begin with a question for you. When was the last time you truly stopped to consider what imagination is? Not the casual meaning you learned as a child. Not the polite encouragement people give when they say, use your imagination. I mean the deeper question. What is this mysterious power that allows you to see something that does not yet exist, to feel a future that has not yet arrived, and to hold an image in your mind that no one else can see? Most people move through their lives without ever asking that question. They use the word imagination almost every day, yet they treat it as something light, almost playful. Sometimes imagination is praised as creativity. Other times it is dismissed as fantasy. When someone invents something remarkable, we celebrate their imagination. But when someone believes too strongly in a vision that others cannot see, we quickly say, that's just your imagination. Notice the contradiction. The same word is used to describe genius and illusion, insight and delusion. It is praised and dismissed within the same breath. Imagine telling a scientist that imagination is useless. Without imagination, no scientific theory would ever be proposed. Imagine telling an architect that imagination has no value. Without imagination, no building would ever rise from the ground. Every bridge, every invention, every painting, every novel, each of them existed first as an invisible image within someone's mind before it appeared in the world. And yet, despite this obvious truth, we still treat imagination as though it was secondary to reality. We are taught that the real world is the physical world around us, the objects we can touch, the events we can observe, the circumstances we call facts. Imagination, according to this view, is simply something the mind does after those facts appear. It reacts to them, it rearranges them, it plays with them, but it does not create them. That assumption has quietly shaped the way many people think about their lives. If the outer world is the true cause of everything, then imagination becomes nothing more than a spectator. You observe what happens, and your imagination comments on it. You encounter circumstances, and your imagination dreams about changing them. But the circumstances themselves remain outside your control. They seem fixed, solid, inevitable. So people learn to adjust themselves to what appears to be real. They learn to measure their dreams against their bank account, their ambitions against their social status, their hopes against the evidence of the present moment. Imagination becomes something you use only when reality allows it. But pause for a moment and look more closely at how life actually unfolds. The world you see today did not simply appear fully formed. Every element of civilization was imagined before it was built. The city skyline was once a set of sketches in someone's mind. The technology in your hands today began as an idea that no one could yet prove. Even the paths people follow in their careers or relationships usually begin as images of what they believe is possible. If imagination were truly powerless, none of these things could exist. Something invisible would never become visible. Something unrealized would never take shape. Yet the history of humanity shows the opposite. Again and again, ideas imagined in private eventually appear as realities shared by millions. This leads to an unsettling thought. What if imagination is not merely reacting to the world but quietly shaping it? What if the images and feelings you entertain within yourself are not harmless mental pictures but seeds that eventually take form in your experience? For many people, this suggestion feels uncomfortable. It challenges the familiar belief that life happens to us. We are accustomed to thinking that circumstances come first and thoughts follow afterward. A person loses a job, and then they feel discouraged. A person receives an opportunity, and then they feel hopeful. Cause and effect appear straightforward. The outer event seems to produce the inner reaction, but there are moments in life when the sequence appears reversed. A person who strongly believes in a possibility often begins to notice opportunities others cannot see. Someone who holds a deep expectation of failure somehow keeps encountering situations that confirm that belief. Two individuals can stand in the same environment, facing the same facts, and yet experience completely different worlds. One sees barriers, the other sees pathways. What makes the difference? It is not always intelligence or education. Often it is something far quieter, something happening inside the unseen theater of the mind. Imagination is not merely the ability to picture things, It is the ability to inhabit a possibility so vividly that it begins to feel natural. When you imagine a future strongly enough, your emotions respond as if that future were already forming. Your decisions shift subtly. Your attention changes direction. You begin to notice things that once escaped your awareness. In this way, imagination acts less like a dream and more like a compass. It directs the invisible movements of thought and feeling that gradually shape behavior. Behavior shapes choices. Choices shape circumstances. And eventually, what began as a silent image becomes something tangible in the outer world. Yet because the process unfolds gradually, most people fail to recognize its origin. By the time the result appears, the original imaginal act has been forgotten. We look at the final event and call it coincidence, luck, or fate. The quiet moment when the idea first appeared in the mind is rarely remembered. That is why the meaning of imagination has become so confused. We see its results everywhere but rarely trace them back to their source. We celebrate achievements without examining the inner visions that made them possible. We criticize failures without noticing the patterns of thought that preceded them. The truth is that imagination operates continuously, whether we understand it or not. Even the person who believes imagination is powerless is still imagining, usually imagining limitations, fears, or doubts that slowly organize their experience around those expectations. Imagination does not stop working simply because we ignore it. This realization changes the entire perspective of life. Instead of asking only what is happening around you, a more important question begins to emerge. What is happening within you? What images do you repeatedly accept as true? What possibilities do you allow yourself to feel as real? These questions are rarely asked because they shift responsibility inward. If imagination plays a role in shaping experience, then the inner world cannot be dismissed as irrelevant. It becomes the quiet starting point of everything that eventually unfolds. Most people discover this slowly, often through moments of reflection when they begin to notice how closely their outer circumstances resemble their inner expectations. The realization is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with thunder or revelation. It begins as a subtle suspicion that the invisible life of the mind may be far more influential than it appears. And once that suspicion takes root, the ordinary meaning of imagination no longer feels sufficient. The word begins to stretch, searching for a deeper definition. What once seemed like a harmless mental ability begins to reveal itself as something far more mysterious, a faculty that quietly bridges the unseen and the visible. Understanding that possibility is the beginning of a different relationship with your own mind, not an escape from reality, but a reconsideration of where reality truly begins. You have probably been told your entire life that reality is something solid, something external, something that exists completely independent of you. The world is presented as a finished stage. Circumstances arrive first, and your thoughts come afterward. You react to events. You adjust to facts. You cope with conditions that appear to have been decided long before you arrived. This idea feels so obvious that it rarely gets questioned. Yet if you slow down and examine your own experience, something strange begins to appear. The world you see is never simply the world. It is always the world as interpreted through your mind. Two people can stand in the same room, look at the same situation, and walk away with entirely different conclusions. One sees opportunity, another sees failure. One senses possibility, another senses limitation. The outer scene has not changed, but the inner interpretation has reshaped the meaning of everything within it. This is where imagination quietly enters the story. Imagination is not merely the ability to picture something that is not there. It is the deeper faculty that organizes how you experience what is there. It shapes the meaning of every circumstance. It colors the emotional tone of every event. It is the invisible lens through which reality becomes personal. Without imagination, the world would appear as a flat sequence of sensory impressions with no depth, no interpretation, no direction. Imagination transforms raw perception into a living narrative. It is the faculty that allows you to take the fragments of life and assemble them into something meaningful. For most people, imagination feels passive. It seems like something that responds to life after it happens. But look again at how human creativity works. Nothing that humanity has ever built began as a physical object. A cathedral begins as a vision before the first stone is placed. A novel begins as a scene before the first word is written. A new scientific discovery begins as a question. And image, a possibility that appears in the mind before the experiment confirms it. The physical world of culture and invention is simply the echo of imagination expressed through time. The world you see around you today, every road, every building, every tool was imagined before it existed. Imagination did not copy reality. It preceded it. If imagination can create architecture, technology, music, and literature, then the question naturally arises, does its creative influence stop there, or does the same principle operate quietly in the shaping of personal experience? This question is uncomfortable because it disrupts the usual hierarchy between inner and outer life. Most people are trained to believe that the external world determines everything, while inner thoughts and feelings are secondary reactions. But if imagination is capable of shaping entire civilizations through ideas and visions, it is difficult to argue that it suddenly loses that creative capacity when it comes to the circumstances of an individual life. Think about how expectations work. When you strongly expect something to happen, your mind begins to move differently. Your attention sharpens toward certain possibilities. Your decisions subtly adjust. You notice things you would have ignored before. Your actions begin aligning with the inner picture you hold. This does not happen through force. It happens through alignment. The imagination sets a direction, and the mind, emotions, and body gradually orient themselves toward that direction. Over time, what once felt like an uncertain possibility begins to crystallize into a lived experience. This is why imagination can be described as a creative principle rather than a decorative faculty. It is not just generating images, it is organizing consciousness. It establishes a pattern that the rest of your psychological life begins to follow. When you consistently imagine yourself as capable, resourceful, or successful, your decisions slowly reflect that assumption. When you repeatedly imagine yourself limited, overlooked, or unlucky, your behavior unconsciously reinforces that expectation. The outer circumstances appear to confirm the belief, but the belief quietly shaped the interpretation and the response that produced those circumstances. The deeper insight here is that imagination does not operate only in dramatic moments of visualization or intense dreaming. It operates continuously, often without your awareness. Every worry is an act of imagination. Every fear of a future outcome is an imaginal scene rehearsed internally. Every hopeful daydream is another example. Whether you intend to or not, your mind is constantly constructing possible futures and emotionally reacting to them. Those internal rehearsals gradually influence the way you move through the world. Imagine two individuals facing a similar challenge. One repeatedly imagines failure. They picture embarrassment, rejection, and disappointment. Their mind rehearses the worst possible outcome. The other imagines a different ending. They see themselves handling the situation calmly, learning, adapting, perhaps even succeeding. When the moment arrives, both individuals carry their imaginal rehearsals into reality. Their behavior, tone of voice, body language, and decisions subtly reflect the inner story they have been telling themselves. The outcome may appear to be determined by luck, but beneath the surface, imagination has already been guiding the process. This does not mean imagination instantly reshapes reality with magical speed. The creative process often unfolds gradually, weaving together inner attitudes and outer circumstances. But the pattern remains consistent. Imagination plants the seed, and experience grows around it. In this sense, imagination acts as the hidden architect of lived reality. It does not replace physical action. It directs the inner orientation from which action arises. There is also a remarkable psychological freedom hidden within this idea. If imagination contributes to shaping experience, then the individual is not completely imprisoned by present circumstances. The current situation may appear fixed, but the imaginal activity behind future experience is still unfolding. The story has not finished writing itself. Imagination remains active, capable of introducing new possibilities into the flow of events. Consider how often major changes in life begin with a quiet shift in perspective. A person who once felt trapped begins to imagine a different future. At first, the vision feels unrealistic, almost fragile, but as the image becomes more familiar, it begins to influence choices. New actions appear. Opportunities that once seemed invisible suddenly become noticeable. Over time, the individual discovers that what once seemed impossible has gradually become part of reality. From the outside, it may look like luck or sudden change. From the inside, it feels like a slow unfolding of something that was already alive within the imagination. This is why imagination deserves to be taken seriously. It is not merely a source of entertainment or distraction. It is the faculty through which the mind experiments with reality before reality takes form. It is the place where possibilities are tested, refined, and emotionally experienced long before they appear in the outer world. When you begin to see imagination in this light, the ordinary boundary between thought and reality becomes less rigid. You start to notice that imagination and experience are not enemies but partners in a continuous process. The visible world reflects patterns that were once invisible. The future quietly grows out of the images and feelings repeatedly entertained in the present, and when you look closely enough, it becomes difficult to separate the two. There is a moment in every serious search for truth when familiar ideas begin to shift under your feet. Words you have heard since childhood suddenly feel less certain. Stories you once accepted at face value begin to reveal deeper layers. And nowhere does this happen more dramatically than in the way people understand the figure of Christ. For many centuries, Christ has been approached almost entirely as a historical person, a teacher who lived, spoke, performed miracles, and left behind a spiritual legacy. Entire traditions have been built around that understanding. Churches, doctrines, rituals, and debates have grown from the belief that Christ must be sought outside the individual, somewhere in the distant past or in the heavens beyond the visible world. Yet there is another way of reading these ancient words, one that does not deny their significance but transforms their meaning entirely. Imagine that the central figure of the Gospels is not merely a biography but a symbol. Imagine that the story of Christ is not primarily a record of events long ago but a description of something that can occur within the human mind itself. The idea may sound unusual at first, but the scriptures themselves repeatedly hint in this direction. Phrases appear again and again, suggesting that the kingdom of heaven is not located in some remote place but within the individual. The kingdom of God is within you, Christ in you, the hope of glory. These lines quietly point toward an interpretation that many readers overlook. They suggest that the drama described in sacred language might actually be unfolding inside human consciousness. When this possibility is taken seriously, the meaning of Christ begins to expand beyond the boundaries of historical interpretation. Christ becomes less a distant figure and more a living principle. And what is that principle? According to the perspective we are exploring, Christ represents the awakened imagination within the human being. In other words, Christ is not merely someone who once lived. Christ is the creative power through which life continually unfolds within you. This interpretation may seem radical, but consider the implications carefully. If imagination is truly the faculty through which unseen possibilities become visible realities, then it occupies a role far more significant than ordinary thinking allows. It becomes the bridge between the invisible world of ideas and the visible world of experience. This is precisely the role attributed to Christ in many spiritual writings. Christ is described as the mediator between the divine and the human, the channel through which the unseen becomes manifest. If imagination performs this same function, if it transforms invisible images into lived reality, then the identification begins to make sense. The story of Christ may not be describing a distant miracle, but an inner process that is available to every person. The birth of Christ, in this interpretation, is the awakening of imaginative awareness within the individual mind. It is the moment when a person realizes that the images they entertain internally are not trivial fantasies, but the seeds from which experience grows. This realization can feel both empowering and unsettling. It suggests that the creative authority many people attribute to fate, or chance, or external forces might actually reside within the individual. It shifts responsibility inward. The imagination you carry within yourself is not merely a private theater of thoughts. It is the very instrument through which your life takes shape. When imagination is used unconsciously, life appears chaotic and unpredictable. But when imagination is used deliberately, the individual begins to participate consciously in the shaping of experience. Ancient language often describes Christ as a redeemer or savior. If we interpret Christ as the awakened imagination, that description takes on a psychological meaning rather than a purely theological one. Imagination redeems because it allows the individual to move beyond present limitations. A person who can vividly imagine a different state of being is no longer imprisoned by the current moment. The inner vision becomes a pathway toward transformation. In this sense, imagination saves not by escaping reality but by opening the door to a new version of it. Another key theme connected to this interpretation is the idea of forgiveness. In traditional religious language, forgiveness is often understood as the removal of moral guilt, but the word carries another meaning that is closely tied to imagination. To forgive, in its deeper sense, is to release someone from a fixed identity. It is the ability to see a person not only as they appear now but as they might become. When imagination identifies a person with their highest possibility instead of their current limitation, forgiveness occurs naturally. You are no longer holding them captive to their past. Instead, you are recognizing their potential for transformation. Seen from this perspective, forgiveness becomes a creative act. It is an exercise of imagination that allows a new version of reality to emerge. When you imagine someone as better, stronger, wiser, or more compassionate than their present behavior suggests, you are not merely being optimistic. You are participating in the same imaginative process that shapes the world itself. The ability to do this, to identify the invisible potential behind visible behavior, is one of the clearest signs that imagination has awakened within a person. This idea also helps explain why many spiritual traditions emphasize faith. Faith, in its most practical sense, is not blind belief in external miracles. It is trust in the creative power of the inner world. It is the willingness to accept that the images you hold within your imagination are meaningful, that they possess a reality that may not yet be visible. Faith allows a person to remain aligned with a vision, even when present circumstances seem to contradict it. Consider how different life becomes when imagination is recognized as this living principle. Instead of viewing yourself as a passive observer of events, you begin to see yourself as a participant in a deeper creative process. The stories you tell yourself internally begin to matter. The images you entertain about your future begin to feel significant. Your inner life is no longer a background activity. It becomes the center from which your experience unfolds. At this stage, the figure of Christ ceases to be distant. It becomes intimate, immediate, and profoundly personal. The question is no longer whether Christ once lived somewhere in history. The more important question becomes whether the creative imagination within you is awake or asleep. When imagination sleeps, life appears rigid and predetermined. When imagination awakens, the world reveals itself as fluid, responsive, and alive with possibility. And once that awakening begins, even the most familiar words of ancient teachings start to sound different. They no longer point outward toward distant authority. They quietly point inward, toward the creative power already present within you. Let me ask you to notice something about your own life for a moment. Not the obvious things like your job, your routines, or the roles you play in the world. Look deeper than that. Look at the silent space where your thoughts appear. Look at the inner conversations you carry throughout the day, the quiet scenes you replay in your mind, the imagined futures you sometimes visit when no one else is watching. Whether you realize it or not, a large portion of your life is unfolding there. In that invisible theater of imagination, most people move through it unconsciously. Images arise, feelings respond, and the mind drifts from one internal scene to another without much awareness. But occasionally something changes. A moment arrives when a person begins to notice that inner world more clearly. The imagination is no longer just a background noise of thought. It becomes something alive, something active, something capable of directing the flow of experience. This moment of recognition is what can be called the awakening to the imaginative life. It does not happen through a dramatic flash of light or a mystical spectacle. More often it begins quietly. A person notices how frequently their mind returns to certain images. Perhaps they catch themselves replaying a past conversation again and again, imagining what they should have said. Or maybe they find themselves anticipating a future situation with either hope or anxiety. In these small moments, something becomes visible. The imagination is not passive. It is constantly constructing scenes and emotionally reacting to them as though they were real. Now consider what happens when this activity continues for weeks, months, or years. The mind repeatedly rehearses certain possibilities. The same expectations return over and over. The same inner narratives are told again and again. Eventually, those narratives begin shaping behavior. They influence the tone of your voice, the confidence in your decisions, the risks you are willing to take or avoid without realizing it. A person begins living according to the internal story they have been imagining. For most people, this process remains hidden because they assume their inner images are simply responses to life. Something happens in the outer world, and the imagination reacts. But the awakening to the imaginative life reveals something far more interesting. Sometimes the inner image appears first, and the outer experience gradually follows. A person who repeatedly imagines themselves failing begins approaching opportunities with hesitation. Someone who imagines themselves capable begins acting with a quiet sense of certainty. These subtle differences accumulate over time until the results appear obvious, almost inevitable. When you first begin to see this pattern, it can feel unsettling. It means the imagination you once treated casually might be influencing far more than you expected. But it also opens the door to a remarkable kind of freedom. If imagination is shaping the direction of your experience, then it is not merely a spectator in your life. It becomes a creative partner. The images you accept internally are not trivial. They are the starting point of future possibilities. The awakening to this realization often begins with awareness. You start observing your inner activity the way a scientist observes a process. Instead of drifting automatically through your thoughts, you begin noticing them. You become aware of the emotional tone attached to the images you repeat. Are they hopeful or fearful? Expansive or limiting? Calm or anxious? These questions are not meant to create self-criticism. They simply reveal the pattern your imagination has been following. Once awareness develops, something subtle changes in the way imagination is used. Instead of being dragged along by whatever images appear, you begin experimenting with them. You realize that imagination is not limited to replaying past events or anticipating problems. It can also construct scenes that represent the life you prefer to live. A person who awakens to the imaginative life begins to ask a new kind of question. What would it feel like if things were different? Not as a distant fantasy, but as an immediate inner experience. This is where imagination reveals its deeper power. When you imagine a scene vividly enough, your emotions respond to it. The body reacts as if the imagined situation carries meaning. If you picture yourself succeeding at something important, your posture shifts, your breathing changes, your confidence increases. If you imagine rejection or loss, tension appears in the body even though the event has not happened. The imagination creates emotional experiences that feel real, and those emotions influence how you move through the world. Think of imagination as a rehearsal space for reality. Athletes often visualize successful performance before stepping onto the field. Musicians hear the music internally before playing it aloud. In the same way, the imaginative life becomes a rehearsal for the experiences you are preparing to encounter. When you rehearse confidence internally, confidence begins to appear externally. When you rehearse doubt, hesitation follows. But the awakening to the imaginative life goes beyond simple visualization techniques. It is a shift in identity. Instead of seeing yourself as someone pushed around by circumstances, you begin to see yourself as someone who participates in shaping them through the images you accept as true. This shift does not deny the existence of external conditions. Rather, it recognizes that your inner relationship to those conditions plays a powerful role in determining how they evolve. One of the most interesting aspects of this awakening is how ordinary it feels once it begins. There is no dramatic separation between the inner and outer worlds. They simply begin interacting more consciously. A person who lives imaginatively does not withdraw from life. They engage with it more deliberately. Before reacting to a situation, they pause internally. They ask themselves what kind of experience they are willing to imagine into existence. Over time, the imagination becomes less chaotic and more intentional. The mind learns to dwell on possibilities that align with growth rather than limitation. Instead of rehearsing worst-case scenarios, it becomes natural to rehearse solutions. Instead of replaying past failures endlessly, the imagination begins rewriting those moments with new understanding. This does not erase history, but it changes the emotional relationship you carry with it. The imaginative life therefore becomes a practice rather than an occasional activity. Just as physical fitness develops through repeated exercise, imaginative awareness develops through repeated attention. The more frequently you observe and guide your inner images, the more natural it becomes to live from that creative center. Eventually, you notice something else. The boundary between imagining and living begins to blur. The scenes you once held privately start appearing in subtle forms within daily life. Opportunities align with ideas that once seemed distant. Conversations unfold in ways that resemble the inner dialogues you rehearsed. It is not always dramatic, but the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. And when you reach that point, imagination no longer feels like an escape from reality. It feels like the place where reality quietly begins. A strange thing happens inside the human mind whenever we remember a painful moment. The event itself may be long gone, buried somewhere in the past. Yet the mind has a peculiar ability to bring it back to life. Not physically, of course, but internally, the scene reappears. The words spoken in that moment echo again. The feeling returns almost as vividly as it did the first time, and each time the mind revisits that memory, it quietly strengthens the identity attached to it. The person who hurt you becomes the one who did that. You become the one it happened to. The story settles into place like a photograph that never fades. Most people assume this is simply how memory works, but something deeper is actually taking place. Imagination is repeating a scene, and by repeating it, it keeps the emotional reality of that moment alive. Now here is the interesting part. When the mind continues to replay the same scene over and over, it is not merely remembering the past, it is unconsciously reaffirming it. Every replay reinforces the identity contained in that memory. The person remains the offender. You remain the injured one. The emotional structure of the moment stays intact, even if years have passed. This is why resentment can survive long after the original event disappears from the physical world. The imagination has kept the scene active. Forgiveness, in its deeper meaning, interrupts this pattern, but not in the way people usually think. Forgiveness is not simply deciding to be nice or pretending that something painful never happened. True forgiveness is far more creative than that. It is the act of withdrawing your imagination from the identity created by the past and placing it onto a different image, an ideal one. Think about what that means. When someone behaves poorly, the easiest thing for the mind to do is to define them permanently by that behavior. The imagination freezes them in that moment. But when you forgive, you refuse to hold that image as their final identity. Instead, you choose to imagine them as something more than that single moment allowed them to show. You begin seeing them as capable of wisdom, maturity, or compassion, even if they did not display those qualities before. In doing so, you are not denying the past. You are refusing to let the past dictate the identity you accept for them now. The same principle applies inwardly. Many people carry around an internal portrait of themselves that was painted years ago during moments of failure or embarrassment. Perhaps you once made a mistake that seemed significant at the time. The event passed. Life continued. But the image of yourself from that moment remained alive in your imagination. Without noticing it, you continue identifying with that earlier version of yourself. You replay it whenever you doubt your abilities. You revisit it whenever a new opportunity appears. The imagination quietly whispers the same identity. This is who you are. Forgiveness changes that inner portrait. Instead of clinging to the version of yourself that stumbled in the past, you imagine the version of yourself who learned from that moment and grew beyond it. You allow your imagination to create a new identity, one that reflects the person you prefer to be rather than the person you once appeared to be. This is not self-deception. It is the recognition that identity is fluid, constantly shaped by the images you accept within your imagination. There is something surprisingly liberating about this shift. When forgiveness becomes an imaginative act, the past stops feeling like a prison. Events that once seemed fixed begin to loosen their grip. The mind no longer feels obligated to keep replaying them as though they were permanent definitions of reality. Instead, imagination begins exploring alternative meanings. A mistake becomes a lesson. A conflict becomes an opportunity for understanding. A failure becomes a turning point. You may notice something subtle happening as this shift occurs. The emotional charge attached to the memory begins to fade. The scene loses its sharpness. What once triggered anger or shame now feels distant, almost neutral. This is not because time has erased the event. It is because imagination has changed the identity connected to it. Forgiveness also transforms relationships in ways that are not always immediately obvious. When you hold someone in your imagination according to their ideal self rather than their worst moment, your behavior toward them naturally shifts. Your expectations soften. Your tone becomes less defensive. The atmosphere between you changes. Even if neither of you consciously discusses it, people often respond to the identity they feel others assigning to them. When you see someone as capable of growth, you create an invisible invitation for that growth to appear. Of course, this does not mean every relationship suddenly becomes harmonious. Human behavior remains complex, but the inner tension created by resentment begins to dissolve. Instead of carrying the emotional residue of the past into every interaction, you move forward with a different image guiding your perception. One of the most remarkable aspects of forgiveness is how it frees the imagination itself. When the mind is filled with resentment, much of its creative energy becomes trapped in old scenes. It keeps returning to the same emotional patterns. But once forgiveness occurs, imagination regains its flexibility. It is no longer tied to repeating the past. It becomes available for imagining new possibilities. This is why forgiveness plays such a central role in the imaginative life. Without it, the imagination becomes a museum of old wounds. With it, the imagination becomes a studio where new identities can be formed. At some point, you begin noticing that forgiveness is not something you do once and forget about. It becomes a way of seeing. Whenever the mind tries to define someone permanently by a past mistake, including yourself, you recognize the opportunity to imagine differently, and that quiet shift in perception gradually changes the emotional landscape of your entire life. There is a quiet habit the human mind practices every single day, usually without noticing it. You assume things, not occasionally, constantly. You assume how people feel about you. You assume how events will unfold. You assume whether something will succeed or fail long before the outcome actually appears. These assumptions rarely announce themselves as deliberate choices. They move quietly through the mind, forming expectations that feel so natural you almost mistake them for facts. Someone walks into a room and immediately assumes they will be ignored. Another person enters the same room assuming they will be welcomed. Nothing external has confirmed either belief yet, but the assumption is already alive. And that small inner position begins influencing everything that follows. Most people think of faith as something connected only to religion, belief in a higher power, belief in divine guidance, belief in unseen forces. But in a much more practical sense, faith is something every person exercises all day long. Whenever you assume something to be true without immediate evidence, you are practicing faith. The difference is simply the direction of that faith. Some people place their faith in possibility, others place it in limitation. Both are acts of imagination sustained by assumption. This is where imagination and faith begin to merge into the same inner movement. Imagination constructs the image, faith sustains it. Without faith, imagination remains a fleeting thought that disappears as quickly as it arrived. But when imagination is supported by a steady assumption, when the mind quietly accepts a possibility as real, the image gains emotional weight. It begins influencing perception, attention, and behavior. The imagined state slowly becomes a psychological position from which the individual starts living. Think of a simple example. Suppose a person repeatedly assumes they are not capable enough to succeed at something important. That assumption may have formed years ago, perhaps during a moment of criticism or failure. Since then, the mind has quietly carried that image forward. Whenever a new opportunity appears, the imagination immediately projects the same identity. I'm not the kind of person who can do that. The body responds accordingly. Hesitation appears, confidence disappears, the opportunity fades, and the person interprets the outcome as confirmation of the original assumption. What looked like objective reality was actually the unfolding of a belief sustained by imagination. Now imagine the opposite scenario. A person holds an assumption that they are capable of learning, adapting, and growing. They may not know exactly how something will work out, but their imagination places them in the position of someone who eventually finds a way. When challenges appear, their attention searches for solutions rather than reasons to retreat. They persist longer, they experiment more freely, and eventually their behavior produces results that appear to justify their confidence. Again, what seems like external proof is actually the natural extension of an assumption. The power of assumption lies in its quiet persistence. It does not need dramatic emotional intensity. It simply needs consistency. When the mind repeatedly accepts an idea about reality, the imagination begins arranging inner experiences around that idea. The emotional tone of life shifts subtly. Expectations adjust. Decisions align with the imagined state. Faith, in this sense, is not blind optimism. It is the steady willingness to dwell mentally in a state that may not yet be visible in the outer world. It is the decision to remain aligned with an assumption even when immediate evidence appears incomplete. When a person practices this kind of faith, imagination becomes less like a daydream and more like a living environment within which the mind begins operating. You can observe this phenomenon in everyday situations. A student who assumes they will understand a difficult subject eventually approaches it with patience. A person who assumes a conversation will go badly enters it with tension that almost guarantees conflict. Someone who assumes they will eventually find meaningful work keeps exploring opportunities long after others would have given up. In each case, assumption quietly directs behavior. This does not mean imagination alone replaces action. Rather, imagination establishes the internal state from which action arises. If the state is one of confidence, curiosity, and expectation, the actions emerging from it tend to reflect those qualities. If the state is filled with doubt or resignation, the actions mirror that as well. What makes this principle so fascinating is how ordinary it is. The mind has always worked this way. Every person has experienced moments where they expected something strongly enough that their behavior gradually brought it about. Yet because the process unfolds over time, the imagination behind it often goes unnoticed. People attribute outcomes to luck, timing, or coincidence while overlooking the assumptions that quietly shaped their approach to the situation. When someone begins living with conscious awareness of assumption, the inner landscape changes. Instead of allowing every passing thought to define their expectations, they become more selective about the states they accept. If an idea about themselves feels limiting, they question it. If a possibility feels expansive, they explore it more deeply within imagination. Over time, this practice begins altering the emotional rhythm of daily life. The mind spends less time rehearsing worst-case scenarios and more time inhabiting possibilities worth moving toward. Confidence grows not because external circumstances have guaranteed success, but because the imagination has already become familiar with that success internally. Faith, therefore, becomes a practical skill rather than an abstract concept. It is the discipline of maintaining an inner assumption long enough for life to organize itself around it. The imagination supplies the image, and faith allows that image to remain steady even while the outer world appears unchanged. This shift does not require dramatic effort. Often it begins with small adjustments in the way you speak to yourself internally. Instead of assuming that circumstances are fixed, you allow space for the possibility that they are still unfolding. Instead of assuming that present limitations define the future, you hold the quiet expectation that new outcomes remain possible. Gradually, the imagination becomes less reactive and more deliberate. Assumptions are no longer accidental, they are chosen. And when a person begins living from chosen assumptions rather than inherited doubts, the inner atmosphere of life becomes noticeably different. The world outside may continue moving according to its usual rhythms, yet something subtle has already changed within the individual. Walk into any crowded place, a train station, a busy street, a cafe filled with quiet conversations, and something remarkable is happening that most people never notice. Hundreds of individuals occupy the same physical environment, breathing the same air, hearing the same sounds, seeing the same buildings and streets, yet each person is living in a completely different world. One person feels hopeful about the future, another feels anxious about tomorrow. One is thinking about an opportunity that excites them, while someone else is quietly worrying about a problem that seems impossible to solve. Externally, they share the same environment. Internally, they inhabit entirely different realities. This difference comes from what can be called a state of consciousness. A state of consciousness is more than a passing mood or a temporary thought. It is the overall psychological position from which you interpret life. It is the combination of beliefs, expectations, emotions, and assumptions that form the lens through which you see the world. And the fascinating thing about states of consciousness is that they do not merely influence how you perceive events, they influence the kinds of events you notice, respond to, and eventually experience. Imagine two people beginning the same day. One wakes up already convinced that life tends to work against them. Their mind quickly fills with subtle expectations. Something will go wrong. People will disappoint them. Opportunities will probably pass them by. The other person wakes up with a very different assumption. They feel that life contains possibilities, that unexpected opportunities sometimes appear, that difficulties can often be navigated with patience. The outer day has not yet unfolded, but the inner orientation has already been established. As the day continues, these states of consciousness quietly guide perception. The first person notices every inconvenience. A delayed message feels like rejection. A small problem becomes confirmation that things never work out. Their state of consciousness organizes their experience around disappointment. The second person encounters similar situations but interprets them differently. A delay becomes neutral rather than threatening. A challenge feels like something to explore rather than something to avoid. Gradually, their state of consciousness organizes their experience around possibility. This process is subtle because it rarely feels like a deliberate choice. Most people assume their state of consciousness is simply the result of circumstances. If life goes well, they feel positive. If difficulties appear, they feel discouraged. But over time, something interesting becomes visible. The state a person consistently occupies tends to shape how life unfolds around them. Not instantly, not magically, but steadily. Think of consciousness as a kind of psychological climate. Just as a climate influences what kinds of plants can grow in a region, a state of consciousness influences what kinds of experiences can naturally develop in a person's life. A climate of doubt produces hesitation and missed opportunities. A climate of expectation produces curiosity and engagement. The events themselves may not look dramatically different at first, but the outcomes gradually diverge. One of the most important insights about states of consciousness is that they are not permanent identities. People often describe themselves as though their current mindset defines who they are. Someone might say, "I'm just not confident," or "I'm always unlucky," as if these descriptions represent fixed personality traits. But in reality, these statements describe states, temporary positions the mind has learned to occupy. Just as a person can move from one physical location to another, the mind can move from one state of consciousness to another. The difficulty arises because states tend to feel familiar. When you remain in the same mental environment for a long time, it begins to feel natural. Even if the state produces frustration or limitation, the mind continues returning to it simply because it recognizes the pattern. A person who has lived in a state of self-doubt for years may feel strangely uncomfortable imagining themselves as confident. The new state feels unfamiliar, almost unrealistic. This is where imagination becomes essential. Imagination allows the mind to explore states of consciousness before they become habitual. By imagining yourself responding differently to life, calmer, more capable, more resilient, You begin rehearsing a new state internally. At first it may feel artificial, like trying on unfamiliar clothing. But with repetition, the new state becomes easier to inhabit. Once a new state of consciousness begins to feel natural, the outer world often responds in ways that appear surprising. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become noticeable. Conversations unfold differently. Decisions carry a different tone of confidence. The individual may interpret these changes as luck or coincidence. Yet beneath the surface, something else has shifted. The state from which they are living has changed, and the world they perceive begins reorganizing accordingly. Consider how often this phenomenon appears in everyday life. Someone who once struggled with insecurity gradually develops self-assurance. Suddenly, people respond to them differently. Their ideas receive more attention. Their presence feels stronger. Another person who once felt enthusiastic about life slips into discouragement and begins experiencing a series of setbacks. Observers often attribute these changes to external events, but the deeper cause frequently lies within the shift of consciousness itself. Understanding this principle does not mean blaming yourself for every difficulty you encounter. Life contains countless variables beyond any individual's control, but recognizing the role of states of consciousness gives you a different kind of agency. Instead of waiting passively for circumstances to improve before feeling confident or hopeful, you can begin cultivating those states internally. The outer changes may take time, but the inner orientation becomes available immediately. When you start observing life through this lens, patterns that once seemed mysterious begin to make sense. You notice how frequently people carry their states with them wherever they go. A person who lives in suspicion finds reasons to distrust others even in friendly environments. A person who lives in appreciation notices kindness where others see indifference. The external world contains countless possibilities, yet the state of consciousness acts like a filter, determining which of those possibilities become visible. The most liberating aspect of this realization is the understanding that states are not permanent residences. They are positions you occupy, and positions can change. Sometimes the shift is gradual, almost imperceptible. A person becomes slightly more hopeful, slightly more curious, slightly more open to possibility. At other times, the change feels more dramatic, as though a door has opened in the mind and an entirely different view of life has appeared. Either way, the movement begins internally. The world outside continues moving along its ordinary rhythm, yet the perspective through which you meet that world quietly transforms. Most people approach their desires in a very particular way. They think about them. They picture them somewhere in the distance, like a destination far down the road, a better job, a healed relationship, financial freedom, a new home, recognition, peace of mind, whatever the desire may be. It is usually imagined as something that exists ahead of the present moment. The mind stands here, in the present, and looks forward toward the goal, as though it were observing a distant mountain. You think of the end. You talk about the end. You hope for the end. But internally, you remain positioned outside of it. This subtle difference, thinking of the end rather than thinking from the end, seems small at first. Yet it changes everything about how imagination works. When you think of the end, you are imagining the desire while still identifying with the person who does not yet have it. The internal conversation might sound something like this: I hope this happens. I wonder when it will come. I'll feel happy when it finally arrives. The end exists in the imagination, but you continue seeing yourself as someone separated from it. Your emotional state reflects waiting, hoping, or striving. Thinking from the end is completely different. Instead of mentally standing outside the desire and looking toward it, you move your imagination inside the experience of already having it. You ask a different question, not how will it happen or when will it happen, but rather what would life feel like if this were already part of my reality. The mind stops rehearsing the distance between the present and the desire. Instead, it begins inhabiting the emotional and psychological position of fulfillment. This shift may seem simple, but it alters the entire orientation of consciousness. When you think from the end, the imagination no longer treats the desire as a future event. It treats it as a present state. The feelings associated with that state, relief, confidence, gratitude, stability, become part of your inner experience now rather than later. And because emotions strongly influence perception and behavior, this internal state begins shaping how you move through the world. To understand why this matters, consider how the mind usually handles problems. When a person wants something they do not yet have, they often spend most of their time analyzing the obstacles. They imagine the steps required to reach the goal, the risks involved, the reasons it might fail. The mind becomes absorbed in the process of getting there. Ironically, this often reinforces the feeling of separation between the present moment and the desired outcome. The more attention placed on the difficulty of the journey, the more distant the destination appears. Thinking from the end bypasses that mental struggle. It does not ignore practical action, but it changes the psychological starting point. Instead of beginning from a place of lack, the mind begins from a place of completion. The imagination steps into the scene where the desire has already unfolded and observes life from that perspective. For example, imagine someone who wishes to build a successful career in a field they love. Thinking of the end might involve visualizing the moment of success while simultaneously feeling uncertain about whether it will ever happen. The mind keeps returning to questions like, what if I fail? Or what if I'm not good enough? But thinking from the end means entering the state of someone who already feels aligned with meaningful work. From that state, the individual imagines waking up in the morning with a sense of purpose, speaking confidently about their work, interacting with others as someone who belongs in that environment. The imagination rehearses the emotional reality of fulfillment rather than the anxiety of reaching it. This does not magically eliminate challenges, but it changes the psychological posture from which those challenges are approached. A person who feels internally aligned with success tends to behave differently than someone who feels separated from it. Their decisions carry more clarity. Their communication feels more assured. Their persistence increases because their inner identity already includes the possibility of success. The same principle applies to countless areas of life. Someone seeking emotional peace often spends years focusing on the absence of that peace, analyzing stress, frustration, and conflict. But thinking from the end means entering the state of calmness itself. You imagine how you would respond to daily situations if you were already centered and balanced. You rehearse the inner quiet that would accompany that state. Gradually, your reactions begin reflecting the calmness you have been practicing internally. The imagination becomes a kind of bridge between the present moment and the state you desire to inhabit. When you think from the end, you walk across that bridge mentally before it appears physically. The mind becomes familiar with the emotional environment of the fulfilled desire. One reason many people struggle with this approach is that the imagination initially protests. It says, but this isn't real yet. The mind has been trained to believe that feelings should follow physical evidence rather than precede it. Yet much of human progress has depended on individuals feeling convinced of possibilities before those possibilities became visible. Every invention, discovery, and personal transformation began with someone inhabiting a state that did not yet exist in the outer world. Thinking from the end, therefore, requires a certain willingness to trust the imaginative process. It does not require pretending that current circumstances are different than they appear. Instead, it involves recognizing that circumstances are still evolving and that imagination plays a role in shaping the direction of that evolution. As you practice this shift, you may notice something subtle happening. The tension around your desire begins to fade. Instead of feeling like you are chasing something that keeps moving further away, you begin feeling internally connected to it. The mind becomes less preoccupied with when and more comfortable with the state itself. Eventually, the desire stops feeling like a distant goal and starts feeling like a natural extension of who you are becoming. And from that position, life often begins unfolding in ways that feel less like a struggle and more like a gradual alignment. Sometimes a single story can reveal more about the power of imagination than 100 theories. Ideas about consciousness, states of mind, and assumption may sound abstract when discussed philosophically, but when they unfold within an ordinary human life, something remarkable happens. They become visible, they become personal, and one of the clearest illustrations of imagination in action comes from an experience that appears almost deceptively simple at first. A journey back to an island called Barbados. Picture the situation for a moment. A young man is living in New York during difficult financial times. Work is scarce, money is limited, and the idea of traveling anywhere feels unrealistic. His family lives thousands of miles away in Barbados, yet returning there seems impossible. The cost of the trip alone places it beyond reach, and every practical calculation confirms the same conclusion. The journey cannot happen. Most people in this situation would accept the circumstances as final. They would say, perhaps one day, when things improve, and then they would continue living within the boundaries of what appears possible. But something different occurred in this case. Instead of focusing on the absence of money or the obstacles involved, the man was encouraged to imagine the end of the journey as though it had already happened. Not to wish for it, not to hope vaguely that it might occur, but to enter the experience mentally. He was told to close his eyes and feel what it would be like to stand once again on the island, to hear the familiar voices of family members, to sense the atmosphere of home. The instruction was simple: assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. At first, this might sound like an exercise in optimism or daydreaming, yet the key difference was persistence. Night after night, the man repeated the imaginal scene. He placed himself mentally in Barbados. He heard his friends congratulating him on his return. He felt the emotional relief of being back among people he loved. Each time the mind tried to remind him that the journey was impossible, he gently returned to the same internal scene. Something interesting begins happening when imagination is practiced this way. The mind gradually stops experiencing the imagined scene as something distant. It begins feeling familiar, almost natural. The emotional tone changes from longing to quiet certainty. Instead of thinking about going home, the individual starts feeling as though the journey has already been accomplished internally. Weeks passed. On the surface, nothing had changed. The financial situation remained difficult. No travel plans appeared. From an external perspective, the imagined trip still seemed impossible. Yet the imaginal activity continued. Each night the same scene unfolded within the mind: standing on the island, greeting friends, hearing the sounds of home. Then events began unfolding in ways that could not easily have been predicted. A series of unexpected circumstances opened the possibility of travel. An opportunity appeared that allowed the man to return to Barbados without paying for the journey himself. What once seemed impossible suddenly became reality. Eventually he found himself standing on the island, exactly as he had imagined, hearing the same voices, experiencing the same atmosphere he had rehearsed so many times internally. To many observers, the story might appear to be a coincidence or a fortunate turn of events. But from the perspective of imagination, something else had occurred. The imaginal act preceded the physical experience. The scene was lived internally before it appeared externally. The journey happened twice, first in imagination, then in the world of physical events. This story illustrates an important principle. Imagination does not necessarily dictate the exact path through which an event will unfold. The man did not know how the trip would become possible. He did not plan the sequence of circumstances that eventually allowed it to happen. Instead, he focused on the end, the feeling of already being where he desired to be. The outer world then organized itself through a series of events that led to that outcome. Many people struggle with this idea because they believe imagination must control every detail of the process. They think they must know precisely how a goal will be achieved before allowing themselves to believe in it. But the Barbados story suggests something different. The imagination concerns itself with the destination rather than the route. Once the end is accepted internally, the means often appear through channels the mind could not have predicted. This does not mean imagination operates like a mechanical formula. Life remains dynamic and complex, yet the story reveals how powerful the inner assumption of fulfillment can be. When the mind consistently inhabits a state where the desire already feels real, it begins interacting with life differently. Decisions change, attention shifts. Opportunities that once seemed irrelevant suddenly become meaningful. Another subtle lesson within the story is the role of emotional experience. The imaginal scene was not merely a visual picture, it carried feeling. The man did not simply see himself in Barbados, he felt the relief, the familiarity, the joy of returning home. Those emotions gave the imagined state a sense of reality that went beyond intellectual belief. Over time, The emotional memory of the imaginal experience became stronger than the physical evidence suggesting the journey was impossible. The mind had already accepted the reality of being home. The outer event simply followed the pattern that imagination had established. Stories like this invite a reconsideration of how life unfolds. Instead of viewing circumstances as completely independent of inner experience, they suggest a more interactive relationship between imagination and reality. The images you consistently accept within your mind may be quietly influencing the direction of events. And sometimes the most convincing proof of that relationship appears not in philosophical arguments, but in simple moments like a person standing once again on an island they once believed they would never see again. Watch the way people usually explain events in their lives. When something good happens, they point to an opportunity, a connection, a lucky moment that appeared at the right time. When something difficult happens, they look to external causes as well, circumstances, other people, the economy, bad timing. Almost every explanation begins outside the individual. Life appears to be a chain of external events, pushing and pulling a person from one situation to another. From this perspective, the inner world of thought and imagination feels secondary, like commentary on a story already written somewhere else. Yet if you observe your own experiences closely enough, a different pattern slowly begins to reveal itself. Think about the moments in life when something important changed for you. Perhaps you decided to pursue a different direction in work or relationships. Perhaps you suddenly saw a situation in a new way and your behavior shifted. Often, before the outer change became visible, something moved internally. A new idea appeared, a realization surfaced, a quiet decision formed. That inner movement happened before the outer circumstances reorganized themselves around it. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet it acted like the first domino in a sequence of events. Most people overlook these inner beginnings because they are not dramatic. They occur in silence. A thought forms while walking down the street. A new assumption arises during a quiet moment before sleep. An image appears in the imagination that feels slightly different from the ones repeated before. These internal shifts rarely attract attention, yet they gradually alter the direction of a person's actions. A new conversation takes place. A different choice is made. A new opportunity is recognized where previously nothing seemed available. In this sense, inner movement can be understood as the seed of outer events. When consciousness changes position, the behavior that emerges from it begins changing as well. And behavior, over time, reorganizes the circumstances surrounding a person's life. Consider how often the opposite pattern occurs. A person may remain in the same external environment for years while experiencing completely different results depending on their internal state. Someone who feels confident and curious tends to notice possibilities others ignore. Another person in the same environment may feel discouraged or cautious and therefore overlook those same possibilities. The outer world did not change first. The inner orientation determined what was seen and how it was approached. Inner movement therefore acts as a quiet cause that eventually produces visible effects. It does not operate instantly or dramatically. Instead, it resembles the way a river gradually changes the shape of the land through persistent flow. The mind establishes a direction, and life slowly organizes itself along that direction through a series of small actions, tenses, responses, and interactions. One of the reasons this process is often misunderstood is that the mind tends to focus on visible turning points. When a new job appears, the attention goes to the interview, the opportunity, the decision made by someone else. Yet behind that moment may have been months or years of inner preparation, a shift in self-image, a growing sense of possibility, a decision to see oneself differently. The external event looks like the cause, but it is often the final expression of a change that began much earlier within consciousness. You can see this clearly in personal transformation. When someone decides to live more deliberately, they often begin with a small internal shift. Perhaps they stop telling themselves a certain limiting story. Perhaps they begin imagining a different version of their life with quiet consistency. That imaginal movement alters their emotional tone. They begin speaking differently, noticing different opportunities, and responding to situations with a slightly different attitude. Over time, The outer world begins reflecting that internal change. Relationships evolve, new directions appear. To an outside observer, it may look as though the environment suddenly became more favorable. In reality, the environment is responding to the internal movement that came first. This principle does not mean the outer world is an illusion or that physical events are unimportant. Rather, it suggests that the relationship between inner and outer life is more interactive than it appears. The state of consciousness from which a person lives influences the pattern of events they experience. When imagination enters this process deliberately, the inner movement becomes more intentional. Instead of allowing every passing thought to determine the emotional direction of life, a person begins choosing the states they are willing to inhabit. If the imagination repeatedly returns to images of frustration or limitation, the mind gradually adopts those states as familiar territory. But if imagination explores states of confidence, possibility, or fulfillment, the internal environment begins shifting in that direction. Once that shift occurs, behavior naturally follows. You speak differently because you feel different. You notice different details in conversations. Your decisions reflect a new expectation about what life might contain. These changes may appear small at first, but they accumulate. Eventually, they influence the opportunities that come into your experience and the way others respond to you. Inner movement therefore acts like the hidden beginning of a story that later becomes visible to everyone else. By the time people notice the outer result, the inner cause has often been active for quite some time. The interesting part is that this process is always occurring, whether you are aware of it or not. Every repeated assumption about yourself, every image you return to in imagination, every emotional pattern you rehearse becomes part of the inner environment from which your actions emerge. Some of these patterns lead toward expansion, others toward limitation, but all of them contribute to the direction your life gradually takes. When a person becomes conscious of this relationship, something subtle changes. Instead of reacting only to events after they appear, they begin paying attention to the internal movements that precede those events. They notice the states they enter throughout the day, the assumptions they carry into conversations, the images they repeatedly accept about the future. Over time, this awareness creates a new relationship with life. The outer world continues unfolding as usual, yet the individual recognizes that the quiet movements within consciousness are not insignificant. They are the beginnings of the patterns that eventually appear in visible form. There is an interesting difference between a vague wish and a living experience in imagination. A wish is usually distant, almost abstract. It floats in the mind like a sentence. I wish things were different. I wish this problem would disappear. I wish I could live another kind of life. The words appear, but they rarely create a real inner experience. The mind acknowledges the desire, yet it continues identifying with the present situation. In that sense, a wish is often little more than a statement of dissatisfaction with the current moment. But imagination works very differently when it becomes a drama rather than a wish. A drama contains movement, emotion, sensory detail, and participation. When you watch a film or read a story, you are not simply observing facts, you are entering an unfolding experience. Your mind begins feeling the tension of the characters, anticipating what might happen next. Reacting emotionally to scenes that exist only in imagination, the experience becomes vivid because the imagination is not standing outside the story, it is inside it. The same principle applies when constructing what can be called an imaginal drama of fulfilled desire. Instead of merely wishing for something to occur, you create a short scene that would naturally take place after the desire has already been realized. The key is that the scene is experienced from within rather than observed from a distance. You do not watch yourself achieving the goal, like an audience member watching a film. You enter the scene as the person who is already living it. Consider how this works in practice. Suppose someone desires a sense of financial stability. The mind might usually think about the problem itself, worrying about bills, calculating possibilities, imagining different strategies for improvement. All of these thoughts keep the imagination centered on the absence of what is desired. Constructing an imaginal drama changes the focus completely. Instead of rehearsing the struggle, The mind enters a brief scene that implies the struggle has already ended. Perhaps the person imagines sitting with a friend who congratulates them on their new financial situation. Maybe they picture themselves reviewing a bank account with quiet relief, feeling the sense of security that comes from knowing everything is in order. The scene does not need to be complicated. It only needs to carry the emotional tone of fulfillment. What matters most is the participation of the senses. When imagination becomes vivid enough, it begins feeling less like a distant thought and more like an experience unfolding internally. You hear the tone of someone's voice in the imagined conversation. You feel the emotional shift that accompanies the realization that the desire has been fulfilled. You notice small details in the scene that make it feel authentic. These sensory impressions anchor the imagination within the experience, rather than allowing it to remain abstract. Another important aspect of the imaginal drama is repetition. A single imaginal scene may feel pleasant, but it rarely transforms a deeply ingrained state of consciousness by itself. The mind tends to return to familiar patterns unless a new pattern is introduced consistently. By returning to the same imaginal drama repeatedly, the emotional atmosphere of the scene begins to feel natural. What once seemed like a hopeful fantasy gradually feels like a familiar memory of something already experienced. This shift from wishing to experiencing is subtle but powerful. When the imagination repeatedly enters a scene where the desire is fulfilled, the emotional state associated with that fulfillment becomes part of the present moment. The mind no longer feels like it is waiting for something external to happen before it can relax or feel satisfied. The emotional condition of fulfillment has already been rehearsed internally. It is also important that the imaginal drama remains simple. The mind often tries to construct elaborate scenarios filled with many moving parts, but complexity can make the scene harder to sustain. A short, clear moment is usually far more effective. A handshake, congratulating you on a new achievement. A quiet moment of relief after resolving a long-standing problem. A simple conversation where someone acknowledges the change you desired. These small scenes carry the implication that the goal has already been achieved without requiring the imagination to manage complicated details. One reason this approach is effective is that the mind responds strongly to experiences rather than explanations. You can tell yourself repeatedly that things will improve, but if the imagination continues rehearsing scenes of frustration, the emotional state remains tied to the problem. When you enter a vivid imaginal scene of fulfillment, however, the mind begins experiencing the emotional outcome of the desire even before the outer world reflects it. This does not mean ignoring practical action or real-world decisions. Instead, the imaginal drama quietly shapes the inner state from which those actions emerge. When the mind becomes familiar with the feeling of success, calmness, or completion, it naturally begins behaving in ways consistent with that state. Choices align differently. Opportunities that match the imaginal experience become easier to recognize. The imaginal drama therefore acts as a bridge between desire and lived experience. It is not an attempt to force reality to change instantly. Rather, it establishes the internal environment where the desired outcome already feels natural. From that environment, life begins unfolding through a series of ordinary events that gradually reflect the inner change. What is fascinating about this process is how quietly it operates. To an outside observer, nothing unusual may appear to be happening. A person goes about their day as usual, working, talking, making decisions, responding to situations, yet internally something new has been introduced. The imagination is no longer rehearsing the problem but the resolution. The emotional tone of life begins shifting toward that resolution long before it becomes visible, and as the mind continues returning to that imaginal scene, the sense of distance between the present moment and the fulfilled desire slowly begins to disappear. Close your eyes for a moment and remember a place from your past. Perhaps it is a street you walked many times as a child. Perhaps it is a quiet room where something important once happened. If the memory is vivid enough, something curious occurs. You do not merely recall the place intellectually, you begin to experience it again. The sounds return, the colors appear, the emotional atmosphere of that moment slowly rises within you. Your body may even respond subtly, as if it were once again present in that environment. Yet the place itself is not physically around you. The entire experience is unfolding inside imagination. This simple observation reveals something powerful about the mind. Imagination does not operate only through images. It works through sensation and emotion. The more vividly those senses are engaged, the more real the imagined scene begins to feel. And when the mind experiences something with emotional intensity, it tends to treat that experience as meaningful, whether it is physically present or not. Think about how easily emotion transforms an ordinary moment into something memorable. A conversation that carries strong emotion becomes unforgettable. A moment filled with excitement or relief remains vivid in the mind for years. Emotion acts like a spotlight, illuminating certain experiences and embedding them deeply within consciousness. When imagination combines with emotion, the result becomes even more powerful. The mind begins experiencing a scene internally as though it carries genuine significance. This is why sensory imagination plays such an important role in shaping the states you inhabit. If imagination is merely abstract, if it consists of vague ideas or distant wishes, it rarely alters the emotional atmosphere of the mind. But when imagination includes sensory detail, something changes. You hear the imagined voice of a friend congratulating you. You feel the weight of an object in your hand. You sense the relief or satisfaction that accompanies the fulfillment of a desire. These sensory impressions give the imaginal experience a texture that the mind recognizes as authentic. Emotion acts as the bridge between imagination and belief. Without emotion, the mind treats the imagined scene as entertainment, something pleasant but unreal. With emotion, the mind begins responding to the scene as though it reflects a genuine possibility. The emotional response signals to consciousness that the experience matters. Consider how this works in everyday life. A person who constantly imagines worst-case scenarios often feels anxiety, even when nothing threatening is happening. Their imagination constructs vivid scenes of failure or loss, and the emotions generated by those scenes create real tension within the body. The events themselves have not occurred, yet the emotional response makes them feel present. The imagination has effectively created a psychological experience. The same principle can operate in the opposite direction. When someone vividly imagines a positive outcome, feeling the relief of resolution, the joy of achievement, or the calm of stability, the emotional tone of the mind shifts. The body relaxes. The internal atmosphere becomes more aligned with the state being imagined. Over time, these emotional rehearsals begin influencing how the individual approaches real situations. What makes sensory imagination so powerful is its ability to involve the whole inner world rather than just the thinking mind. When a scene is imagined vividly, the senses participate. You hear, feel, and sometimes even smell elements of the imagined environment. The experience becomes immersive. The mind temporarily steps into another reality. Even though the physical surroundings remain unchanged, athletes often rely on this principle without necessarily describing it in spiritual language. Before an important performance, they imagine the movement of their body, the sound of the crowd, the rhythm of the event. They feel the success internally before the competition begins. Musicians do something similar when they mentally rehearse a piece of music, hearing every note internally before their fingers touch the instrument. These practices demonstrate how sensory imagination can prepare the mind and body for future experiences. In the context of conscious creation, the same process applies to personal desires and goals. Instead of merely thinking about a desired outcome, the imagination enters the scene where the outcome has already been realized. You feel the emotional shift that accompanies the completion of the goal. Perhaps there is relief, gratitude, or quiet confidence. These emotions anchor the imaginal experience within the present moment. Over time, the emotional familiarity of that scene begins influencing how you see the world around you. Situations that once seemed intimidating begin feeling manageable. Opportunities that previously felt distant start appearing more approachable. The mind has already experienced the emotional state associated with the outcome, so the external steps toward that outcome feel less intimidating. Another important aspect of emotional imagination is authenticity. The mind does not respond strongly to forced enthusiasm or exaggerated fantasy. Genuine emotion arises from scenes that feel natural and believable. Often, the most effective imaginal experiences are simple: a brief conversation with someone you trust, a quiet moment of relief after solving a problem, a subtle sense of gratitude as you realize something has worked out. These moments may seem small, yet they carry the emotional signature of fulfillment. When imagination repeatedly returns to such scenes, the emotional state gradually becomes part of your internal landscape. The mind begins to feel at home in the atmosphere of the fulfilled desire. Emotion therefore acts as the energy that brings imagination to life. Without it, imagination remains distant and abstract. With it, imagination becomes a living experience capable of shaping the states of consciousness from which your actions emerge, and as those states become more familiar, the boundary between what is imagined and what is lived begins to feel less rigid than it once appeared. Every day, without realizing it, you carry a collection of scenes in your memory, conversations that ended awkwardly, words you wish you had said differently, moments where something small went wrong but stayed with you longer than it should have. Most people believe these memories are fixed, like photographs sealed in an album. The event happened once, and now it simply exists as part of the past. Because of this assumption, people often treat their memories as something permanent, something they can revisit but never truly change. Yet the mind does something interesting whenever it remembers. It does not actually replay the past exactly as it happened. It recreates it. Each time a memory returns, the imagination rebuilds the scene from fragments, images, emotions, interpretations. That means the past you are experiencing in memory is not the past itself. It is the version of the past your imagination is reconstructing right now. This subtle detail carries enormous implications, because it means the mind is not simply remembering it, is actively reshaping experience every time the memory appears. This is where the idea of revision enters the imaginative life. Revision means returning to a scene that did not unfold the way you preferred and reconstructing it in imagination so that it reflects the outcome you would rather have experienced. Instead of replaying the moment exactly as it occurred, you allow imagination to gently change it. The conversation that ended in frustration becomes a conversation where understanding was reached. The opportunity you believed you missed becomes a scene where you acted with confidence. The mistake you made becomes a moment where clarity appeared instead of confusion. At first, the idea can feel unusual. After all, the event in the outer world has already happened. Changing it in imagination does not literally erase the historical record. But the purpose of revision is not to rewrite history for the sake of denial. Its purpose is to change the emotional and psychological pattern that the memory continues reinforcing in your consciousness. Think about what happens when a negative experience is replayed repeatedly without revision. Each time the mind revisits the scene, the same emotional reaction returns. The memory strengthens the belief connected to it. A single moment of embarrassment may gradually become an internal story about inadequacy. A brief misunderstanding with someone might evolve into a lingering sense of resentment. The past event becomes a seed from which an entire pattern of expectation grows. Revision interrupts that pattern. When you reconstruct the scene differently, the emotional charge attached to the memory begins shifting. The mind no longer rehearses the same limitation every time the event appears. Instead, it begins associating the moment with a new outcome, one that aligns with the person you prefer to be. The metaphor often used to describe this process is that of pruning a garden. In a garden, branches that grow in unproductive directions are trimmed so the plant can grow more harmoniously. The plant itself remains alive, but its growth becomes healthier and more balanced. Revision works in a similar way within the imagination. You do not remove entire sections of your life story. You simply trim the emotional patterns that no longer serve the direction you wish to grow. Consider how this might unfold in a practical situation. Imagine you had a conversation earlier in the day that left you feeling uneasy. Perhaps you responded defensively or said something you later regretted. Normally, the mind might replay that moment repeatedly throughout the evening, strengthening the feeling of discomfort. But through revision, you return to the scene before sleep and reconstruct it. You imagine yourself speaking calmly, expressing your thoughts clearly, leaving the conversation with a sense of mutual understanding. When you replay the revised version several times in imagination, something subtle begins happening internally. The emotional memory attached to the original event starts losing its intensity. The mind begins associating the scene with the revised experience instead. Over time, the psychological meaning of the event changes. Instead of reinforcing a story of tension or regret, the memory begins supporting a sense of clarity and confidence. This does not mean the outer circumstances of the day instantly rearrange themselves. The conversation still occurred as it did in the physical world, but the inner consequence of that event, its emotional and imaginative imprint, has been transformed. And because imagination influences future behavior, that transformation affects how similar situations are approached later. One of the most fascinating aspects of revision is how it alters the relationship between past, present, and future. Most people believe the past shapes the future directly. They assume that what happened yesterday inevitably determines what will happen tomorrow. But when imagination revises the emotional meaning of past events, the future is no longer tied to the same pattern. The mind begins moving forward from a different psychological starting point. This shift becomes especially important when dealing with experiences that once felt discouraging. Many individuals carry memories that quietly influence their expectations for years. A failed attempt becomes proof that success is unlikely. A painful interaction becomes evidence that relationships are unsafe. Without revision, these memories continue guiding the imagination in subtle ways. Revision dissolves that guidance by replacing the internal reference point. Instead of returning to a scene that reinforces limitation, the mind begins returning to a scene that reflects possibility. Over time, the imagination grows accustomed to the revised pattern. What makes this practice powerful is its simplicity. It does not require complex techniques or dramatic effort. It only requires the willingness to revisit the day before sleep and gently reshape any moment that felt out of alignment with the life you wish to experience. The imagination performs the adjustment quietly, much like a gardener tending to a growing landscape. Gradually, the collection of memories within consciousness begins carrying a different emotional tone. Moments that once supported doubt now support confidence. Scenes that once replayed frustration now reflect resolution. The internal narrative of life begins shifting without the need to erase any chapter entirely. And as this process continues, something unexpected happens. The imagination stops behaving like a recorder of the past and begins acting more like an editor, quietly refining the story you carry forward into the future. There is a peculiar way the human mind treats the past. It behaves as though yesterday were a finished object, solid, immovable, sealed behind us like a closed door. When something painful happens, the event seems to freeze into memory, and we carry it forward as proof of what life has been. A harsh word spoken years ago can still echo inside the mind today. A single disappointment can quietly shape expectations for a long time afterward. People often believe they are remembering the past exactly as it occurred. Yet what they are actually experiencing is the past as imagination continues to interpret it. Memory is not a recording device. It is a creative reconstruction. Each time a scene from the past returns to the mind, the imagination rebuilds it from fragments, images, feelings, interpretations, and assumptions about what the event meant. That means the version of the past you experience today is not identical to the moment that originally occurred. It is the version your imagination is currently presenting to you. This small insight carries an unexpected consequence. If the past is experienced through imagination in the present moment, then the emotional meaning attached to it can also be changed in the present moment, not by denying what happened, but by allowing imagination to reshape the interpretation of that event. This is where forgiveness takes on a deeper meaning. Most people think forgiveness means letting go of anger toward another person, and while that is part of it, forgiveness can also be understood as the ability to release the emotional authority the past seems to hold over the present. When you forgive, you stop allowing a past scene to dictate your expectations of yourself or others. One of the ways this happens is through the act of rewriting the past in imagination. Imagine returning to a memory that has continued to disturb you. Perhaps it was a conversation where someone misunderstood you. Perhaps it was a moment where you felt embarrassed or rejected. Normally, the mind replays such scenes exactly as they happened, reinforcing the same emotional response each time the memory appears. But instead of replaying the event as it occurred, imagine altering it. The conversation ends with understanding instead of tension. The moment of embarrassment becomes a moment of calm confidence. The words spoken carry kindness instead of conflict. In imagination, you allow the scene to unfold in a way that reflects the outcome you wish had occurred. At first, this may feel unusual, even unnecessary. After all, the outer event already happened, but the emotional pattern attached to the event still lives in your imagination. And that pattern influences how you approach similar situations in the future. By revising the memory internally, you transform the psychological meaning of the experience. Forgiveness emerges naturally from this process. When the past is rewritten in imagination, the emotional charge surrounding it begins to dissolve. Resentment loses its intensity because the mind is no longer rehearsing the original conflict. Instead, it becomes familiar with a different version of the scene, one that reflects harmony or resolution. This shift does not require you to pretend that someone never hurt you. It simply allows your imagination to stop reinforcing the identity of that moment. The person who once appeared as an adversary in your memory is no longer defined solely by that scene. The image changes, and with it, the emotional atmosphere connected to the relationship. Something similar happens when the past involves your own actions. Many people carry memories of mistakes that quietly shape their self-image. A decision made years ago may continue appearing in imagination as proof that they are incapable, careless, or unworthy. The mind returns to that scene repeatedly, strengthening the identity associated with it. Rewriting the past interrupts this pattern. Instead of replaying the mistake as the defining moment of the story, imagination introduces a different response. You see yourself acting with clarity. You imagine handling the situation wisely. You experience the emotional relief that would have followed such a response. Gradually, the internal identity connected to that memory begins shifting. This does not erase responsibility or learning. In fact, it often deepens the lesson. When the emotional weight of regret disappears, the mind becomes free to extract insight from the experience rather than simply reliving its discomfort. The past becomes a source of understanding instead of a source of limitation. The process may seem small, but its influence can be profound. Every memory you carry contributes to the inner narrative through which you interpret the present. If those memories continually reinforce disappointment, fear, or resentment, your imagination will expect similar patterns in the future. When the past is revised through imagination, the narrative changes. The future no longer has to resemble the earlier scene. Forgiveness, therefore, becomes less about moral duty and more about imaginative freedom. It is the ability to choose which version of the past will live within your consciousness. The original event may remain part of history, but the emotional story attached to it becomes something you can reshape. Over time, this practice creates a subtle transformation in the way you experience life. The mind stops behaving like a museum that preserves every painful moment exactly as it occurred. Instead, it becomes more like a workshop where experiences are refined, reinterpreted, and integrated into a broader understanding of growth. As this process continues, the past gradually loses its rigid authority. Memories still exist, but they no longer carry the same emotional weight. The imagination has replaced the old pattern with something more balanced. And in that quiet adjustment, forgiveness stops feeling like something you struggle to achieve. It becomes the natural result of seeing the past through a different lens. There is a conversation happening inside you almost all the time. It continues while you walk down the street, while you listen to someone speak, while you sit quietly alone, even while you are preparing to fall asleep at night. Most of the time you do not notice it because it feels so familiar. It is not spoken out loud. Yet the sentences form clearly enough that you could almost hear them if you paused long enough. This quiet dialogue, this inner speech, may be one of the most influential forces shaping your experience of life. Think about it for a moment. Throughout the day, your mind comments on what happens around you. You interpret situations, predict outcomes, explain other people's behavior, and describe yourself to yourself. Sometimes the inner voice is encouraging. At other times it is critical, doubtful, or impatient. The tone changes depending on circumstances, but the conversation itself rarely stops. What makes inner speech so powerful is that it does more than simply describe reality. It gradually shapes your expectations about what reality will become. The phrases you repeat internally begin to form assumptions about who you are, what other people are like, and what kinds of outcomes are possible. These assumptions influence the emotional atmosphere in which you move through the world. Consider how quickly a single internal sentence can affect your mood. If the mind repeats something like, "This will probably go wrong," the body subtly tightens. Attention becomes cautious. Your imagination begins anticipating problems before they appear. On the other hand, if the mind quietly says, "I can handle this," the body responds differently. The same situation may still be uncertain, but the emotional tone shifts toward calm readiness. Over time, these internal conversations accumulate into patterns. A person who repeatedly tells themselves they are capable begins approaching challenges with curiosity rather than hesitation. Someone who constantly reminds themselves of past failures may unconsciously expect new situations to end the same way. The outer events of life then appear to confirm the internal narrative that has been playing quietly in the background. This is why inner speech can be described as the seed of future reality. The words you repeat within your imagination shape the states of consciousness you inhabit. Those states influence how you perceive opportunities, how you respond to difficulties, and how others experience your presence. Most people assume that inner speech simply reflects circumstances. Something happens externally, and the mind comments on it. Yet if you observe carefully, you may notice the sequence sometimes moves in the opposite direction. The internal conversation begins shaping how you interpret events even before they unfold. Two individuals might walk into the same meeting, but their inner speech determines whether they interpret the atmosphere as welcoming or threatening. The conversation inside their minds prepares them for the experience they expect to have. What makes inner speech particularly interesting is that it often involves imagined dialogue with other people. You may find yourself mentally rehearsing a conversation before it occurs. You imagine what someone will say and how you will respond. You predict their reaction and prepare your answer. Sometimes the imagined conversation becomes so detailed that it feels almost real. These rehearsals are not meaningless. They influence the emotional state you bring into the real interaction. If your inner speech anticipates criticism, you may enter the conversation defensively. If your inner speech anticipates understanding, you may approach the same interaction with openness. The external conversation then unfolds within the atmosphere created by the internal one. Many creative thinkers and spiritual teachers have suggested that inner speech functions like a rehearsal for life itself. The sentences you repeat internally prepare the mind for certain kinds of experiences. When the same thoughts appear often enough, they begin shaping the direction of your attention and behavior. This does not mean that every passing thought carries equal influence. The mind produces countless fragments of speech throughout the day. What matters most are the phrases that return repeatedly, the ones that feel emotionally convincing. These sentences gradually become the foundation of your expectations. For example, someone who continually tells themselves, "Things never work out for me," begins noticing evidence that confirms that belief. Situations that might have led to success are interpreted through the lens of doubt. The inner narrative shapes the meaning of events long before their outcomes become clear. But the opposite pattern can develop as well. When a person intentionally shifts the tone of inner speech, the atmosphere of consciousness begins changing. Instead of predicting failure, the mind begins anticipating possibility. Instead of replaying criticism, it begins rehearsing calm and constructive responses. This shift does not require unrealistic optimism or forced positivity. It simply involves becoming aware of the internal dialogue and gradually guiding it toward language that supports the state you wish to inhabit. Over time, the new inner speech begins feeling more natural than the old one. One helpful way to notice this process is during quiet moments at the end of the day. As you prepare to sleep, the mind often drifts into a series of internal conversations about what happened earlier and what might happen tomorrow. These moments reveal the patterns of speech that have been shaping your expectations. By gently redirecting the dialogue towards scenes of resolution or confidence, the imagination begins planting different seeds within consciousness. Just as a gardener chooses which seeds to place in the soil, the mind gradually learns to choose which sentences it allows to take root. Some thoughts fade quickly. Others grow into strong beliefs that influence behavior for years. When inner speech becomes aligned with the states you wish to experience, the emotional environment of life changes subtly. You begin approaching situations with a different tone of mind. Conversations unfold more calmly. Decisions carry less hesitation. Opportunities that once seemed distant begin appearing within reach. None of this happens through force. The outer world continues moving through its usual rhythms, yet something inside the individual has shifted. The quiet conversation guiding their imagination has taken a new direction, and from that direction, the future begins forming long before anyone notices it. There is a quiet pattern running beneath almost everything you do each day. You wake up at roughly the same time. You move through familiar routines. You react to situations in ways that often feel automatic. These patterns are so ordinary that most people hardly notice them. Yet they shape an enormous portion of life. We call them habits. Habit is the invisible structure behind behavior. It is the reason certain thoughts appear before you even decide to think them. The reason certain emotions rise before you consciously choose how to feel. Most people think of habits only in physical terms. Habits of eating, working, exercising, or sleeping. But there is another kind of habit that operates more quietly and often more powerfully: mental habit. These are the patterns of thought and imagination that repeat themselves day after day. The mind becomes accustomed to certain ways of interpreting events, certain emotional reactions, certain assumptions about what life is likely to bring. Over time, these mental patterns become so familiar that they feel like part of your identity. Imagine someone who has spent years telling themselves that life is difficult and unpredictable. Even when things are going relatively well, the mind continues scanning for signs of trouble. A small inconvenience becomes proof that problems are beginning again. This reaction is not deliberate. It is habitual. The imagination has rehearsed the pattern so many times that the mind automatically returns to it. Now imagine another person who has developed a different mental habit. They expect life to present challenges, but they also assume that solutions usually exist. When difficulties appear, their mind immediately begins exploring possibilities instead of anticipating defeat. The outer situations both individuals encounter may look similar, yet the internal response is guided by different habits of imagination. This is why the idea of a mental diet becomes so important. Just as the body is influenced by the food you consume, the mind is influenced by the thoughts you repeatedly entertain. If the imagination constantly absorbs images of frustration, worry, or self-doubt, those patterns become part of your habitual state of consciousness. The mind begins expecting life to reflect those images. A mental diet does not mean forcing yourself to think cheerful thoughts all day long. Instead, it means becoming aware of the kinds of ideas you allow to settle into your imagination. Many thoughts appear automatically because they have been repeated for years. But when you begin observing them, you realize that not every thought deserves your attention. For example, you might notice a recurring internal sentence: "This probably won't work." For years, that phrase may have appeared without question, shaping how you approach new opportunities. Through awareness, you begin recognizing that the sentence itself is a habit rather than a fact. Once you see it clearly, you can choose whether to continue feeding that pattern or to replace it with something more constructive. The discipline of imagination begins here. Discipline does not mean rigid control or harsh self-criticism. It simply means directing your attention deliberately rather than allowing every passing thought to define your mental environment. If an idea appears that reinforces limitation, you acknowledge it without letting it dominate your imagination. If a thought supports the state you prefer: confidence, curiosity, calm, you allow it to grow. Over time, the mind gradually develops new habits of perception. Instead of reacting automatically with worry, it becomes more accustomed to exploring solutions. Instead of repeating old stories about failure, it begins entertaining possibilities that were previously dismissed. One of the most important moments for this discipline occurs just before sleep. At the end of the day, the mind naturally reviews events and anticipates tomorrow. Without awareness, this period often becomes a rehearsal of frustrations or unfinished concerns. But when the imagination is guided intentionally, Those same moments become an opportunity to reinforce the states you wish to experience. A person practicing a mental diet might gently replace the day's tensions with a simple imaginal scene of resolution. Perhaps they recall a conversation and imagine it ending with understanding. Perhaps they picture themselves handling tomorrow's responsibilities with calm assurance. These brief scenes become seeds planted in the imagination before sleep, because the mind is especially receptive during these quiet transitions between wakefulness and sleep. The emotional tone of those scenes can influence how the imagination organizes future expectations. Over time, repeating such scenes establishes a new pattern within consciousness. It is important to remember that habits do not change instantly. The mind tends to return to familiar pathways, especially when emotions run high. A single moment of discouragement does not undo the discipline of imagination, just as a single unhealthy meal does not determine physical health. What matters is the overall direction of attention over time. As new habits of imagination form, the internal atmosphere of life begins shifting. Situations that once triggered automatic doubt may now evoke curiosity. Conversations that once felt tense may unfold more naturally. The mind becomes less reactive and more deliberate in how it engages with the world. Interestingly, the outer changes that follow often appear gradual rather than dramatic. Opportunities emerge quietly. Relationships evolve through subtle differences in communication. Personal confidence grows through repeated experiences of handling situations calmly. What seems like coincidence from the outside often reflects the steady transformation of inner habits. The discipline of imagination, therefore, becomes less about forcing life to change and more about cultivating the mental environment from which life is experienced. When the imagination is nourished with constructive ideas and guided away from patterns that reinforce limitation, consciousness gradually settles into states that support growth. Over time, this practice feels less like discipline and more like familiarity. The mind begins returning naturally to images and assumptions that align with the life you prefer to live. And in that quiet consistency, the imagination becomes something more than a passing activity. It becomes the atmosphere in which your future slowly forms. One of the most unusual ideas you will encounter on this journey of imagination is the suggestion that creation is already finished. At first, that statement sounds almost impossible. Look around at the world. New events appear every day. New inventions emerge. New lives begin. Entire civilizations change over time. Everything seems to be unfolding moment by moment. So how could anyone say that creation is already complete? Yet the idea does not mean that nothing new will ever happen. It means something far more subtle. It suggests that every possible state of experience already exists as a potential pattern within consciousness. What we call new events are actually movements into different states that were always available, even if we were not aware of them before. Think of life as a vast landscape of possibilities. Within this landscape, there are countless states of being, states of confidence, fear, wealth, struggle, joy, creativity, loneliness, peace. Each state carries its own patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. When someone occupies one of these states, the world they experience begins reflecting the assumptions that belong to that state. Imagine two individuals walking through the same city on the same day. One person feels hopeful and curious. The other feels discouraged and suspicious. Although the streets, buildings, and people around them are identical, their experiences of the city will feel entirely different. One notices opportunities and friendly interactions. The other notices inconvenience and tension. The external environment remains the same. Yet the internal state determines what each person perceives. This illustrates the idea of states of consciousness. A state is not simply a temporary mood. It is a pattern of perception through which you interpret life. Each state carries its own emotional atmosphere and its own expectations about how the world behaves. When you enter a state, your imagination naturally produces thoughts consistent with that state, and your behavior begins reflecting those thoughts. Now consider what it means if countless states already exist within the landscape of consciousness. It would mean that the experiences you encounter in life are not being invented from nothing each day. Instead, they emerge as you move from one state into another. The external events that follow, often appear mysterious or coincidental, but they are consistent with the state you have entered. This perspective changes the way you understand personal change. Many people believe they must struggle to force life into a different shape. They try to manipulate circumstances directly, believing that success requires pushing reality in a new direction. But if creation is already finished, if every possible pattern of experience already exists, then transformation becomes a matter of moving into a different state rather than inventing something entirely new. Think of it like tuning a radio. The music already exists within the range of frequencies around you. The radio does not create the music. It simply selects the station that is already broadcasting. In a similar way, your state of consciousness determines which patterns of experience you are tuned to perceive and participate in. When someone shifts from a state of doubt into a state of quiet confidence, their behavior changes naturally. They speak differently. They make decisions with greater clarity. They notice opportunities that once passed unnoticed. The external world responds to these subtle differences, and life begins reflecting the new state. From this viewpoint, imagination becomes the means by which you explore and enter different states. When you imagine a scene in which a desired outcome has already occurred, you are temporarily stepping into the state where that outcome feels natural. The emotions associated with that state begin appearing in the present moment. Over time, repeated experiences of that imaginal state make it feel more familiar. Familiarity is important because the mind tends to return to what feels natural. If confidence feels unfamiliar, the mind often drifts back toward doubt. But if the imagination has repeatedly experienced the feeling of confidence, the state gradually becomes easier to occupy. What is fascinating about this process is that the states themselves do not belong to any single individual. They exist as possibilities within consciousness itself. One person may occupy a state of creativity and innovation, while another occupies a state of hesitation or uncertainty. The difference lies not in the external world, but in the state through which each person is viewing that world. This idea can be both liberating and humbling. It suggests that the limitations we experience are not permanent features of reality, but reflections of the states we currently inhabit. At the same time, it reminds us that moving into a new state requires patience and awareness. Old habits of thought may continue pulling attention back toward familiar patterns, yet every moment offers the possibility of shifting states. When you pause and imagine a different outcome, when you choose an assumption that reflects calm rather than fear, when you begin speaking to yourself in language that supports growth rather than limitation, you are exploring a different region of the landscape of consciousness. Gradually, the state you occupy most frequently begins shaping the rhythm of your life. The thoughts that arise become consistent with that state. The actions you take reflect its assumptions. The opportunities you recognize align with its expectations. From the outside, such changes often appear mysterious. People may describe them as luck, coincidence, or sudden transformation. Yet from within the individual, the shift feels quieter. It feels like stepping into a different way of being that was always available but not previously recognized. And in that quiet movement between states, the idea that creation is finished begins to make a certain kind of sense. The possibilities were always present. What changed was simply the state from which life was experienced. There comes a point on the path of imagination where something subtle yet profound begins to change. Until this moment, you may have practiced imagining desired outcomes, revising memories, guiding inner speech, and disciplining your thoughts. All of these practices gradually reshape the atmosphere of your inner world, but eventually a deeper realization begins to appear, and it shifts the meaning of everything that came before it. You begin to see that imagination itself is not merely a tool you occasionally use. It is the very center of your awareness. The creative power you have been practicing with is not separate from you. It is you. Throughout history, spiritual language has often described this inner creative presence using symbolic names. One of the most famous symbols is the idea of Christ within. For many people, this phrase has been interpreted only in a religious or historical sense, referring to a figure from the past. Yet the deeper meaning points towards something far more intimate. Christ represents the awakened awareness of creative imagination operating consciously within the individual. This awakening does not arrive through dramatic visions or sudden miracles. It usually appears quietly, through a gradual shift in perception, the moment you realize that the imagination shaping your experiences is not something external but something living within your own consciousness. The relationship between you and life begins to change. Before this realization, it is easy to believe that circumstances hold the primary power. The outer world appears to dictate how you must feel, what you can expect, and what possibilities are available. When events unfold differently than you hoped, it feels as though life itself has closed certain doors, but when the inner creative presence becomes clear, the direction of influence reverses. You begin noticing that the states you inhabit internally are constantly shaping how you interpret events, how you respond to situations, and how others interact with you. Circumstances still exist, yet they no longer feel like the ultimate authority over your experience. The awakening of Christ within is therefore not about escaping the world. It is about recognizing the creative role you play in experiencing it. The imagination you once treated as a private mental activity reveals itself as the living center through which your reality is interpreted and expressed. At this stage, something else becomes possible, living from the ideal state rather than merely imagining it occasionally. Earlier practices often involve stepping into a desired state briefly, perhaps during meditation or before sleep, then returning to ordinary habits of thought during the day. But as awareness deepens, the ideal state begins feeling less like a temporary exercise and more like a natural place to stand. Living from the ideal state means allowing your internal assumptions to reflect the version of yourself you have already imagined becoming. If you imagined yourself calm and capable, the inner dialogue during daily activities begins reflecting that calm confidence. If you imagined a life filled with creative expression, your attention naturally gravitates toward opportunities to create. The difference may appear small from the outside, yet internally it is profound. Instead of repeatedly reminding yourself that the desired state exists somewhere in the future, you allow the feeling of that state to exist in the present. The imagination no longer visits the ideal state like a traveler passing through. It begins dwelling there. This shift often reveals another insight. The ideal state was never truly distant. It existed as a possibility within consciousness all along. What changed was your willingness to occupy it consistently. Living from the ideal state does not mean pretending that life contains no challenges. Difficult moments still appear. Unexpected situations still arise. But the state from which you meet those situations carries a different quality. Instead of reacting with immediate doubt or fear, the mind remains grounded in the assumptions you have cultivated through imagination. A person living from the ideal state might still encounter uncertainty, yet their response emerges from a deeper center of awareness. They approach situations with curiosity rather than resistance. They look for solutions rather than confirming limitations. The imagination continues quietly supporting the emotional atmosphere of the life they wish to experience. Over time, this consistent state influences the rhythm of daily life. Relationships often shift because the tone of your presence has changed. Conversations unfold differently because your expectations carry a new quality. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become easier to recognize. From the outside, these developments may appear like fortunate coincidences, yet from within, they feel like the natural extension of the state you have been living in. The awakening of Christ within therefore marks a turning point in how imagination is understood. It is no longer something you occasionally practice to improve circumstances. It becomes the living awareness through which circumstances are interpreted and shaped. In many ways, the journey that began with curiosity about imagination ends with a deeper form of simplicity. You realize that the creative power you were seeking was never distant or mysterious. It has always been present in the quiet movement of your own awareness. And once that realization settles into daily life, imagination no longer feels like a technique to be remembered. It becomes the natural expression of the consciousness through which you are already experiencing the world.